I'm joined by the New York Mets beat writer for MLB.com and chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America, Anthony DiComo, to talk about his new book on the career of the Mets' all-time leader in runs, hits, doubles, and RBIs, the seven-time All-Star, two-time Gold Glove Award winner, two-time Silver Slugger, and captain of the New York Mets. Number 5, David Wright.
There's David Wright's first big league hit. And
oh, David Wright! What a play!
Oh. It's over his head and the Mets win it! David Wright with the walk-off hit in the bottom of the ninth off Mariano Rivera. A true Gold Glove gem from David Wright. It's out of here! The Mets win the ball game! Say hello to Citi Field. The first Met home run of their new home. And Wright makes a brilliant catch. David Wright is now the Mets' all-time hits leader.
The captain, number 5, David Wright.
You can pre-order the new book, The Captain, from wherever you get your books. It is set to be released on October 13th. So, Anthony, how do you evaluate the Mets' 2020 season?
No, I think a bit of a disappointment, especially once you get into summer camp after all the COVID stuff happens and you get there and Major League Baseball expands the playoffs to 8 teams per league. You have to look at it at that point. And the Mets are going to be one of the top 8. And you heard from a lot of players towards the end of the season. We should have been one of those teams. We have the talent to be one of those 8 teams, and they just were not able to together. There were fits and starts. They didn't win more than 3 games in a row the whole season. It really was a matter of when they hit, they didn't pitch. When they pitched, they didn't hit. When they did both, the bullpen gave it up. They just really could not put it all together as a unit. So, again, I don't think there's any way to look at it but disappointment. This is a team that was built to win now. The Mets mortgaged a lot of the farm over the last 2 years to win now, and they didn't make the playoffs. Yeah, I would say definitely a disappointment.
So the Mets led the league in batting average, hitting .272 as a team, yet they were leaving about 4 runners on base per game. Where do you attribute that to? The manager, the hitting coach, or is it inconsistency in a short 60-game season?
I think it's inconsistency. I know a lot of people love to point to the fact that the Mets hitting coach was not on site. He was in Arizona because he was a COVID risk. And I really don't think that's it. The Mets did have 2 hitting coaches on site all season who practice the same philosophies. A lot of the prominent players have their own personal hitting coaches that they lean on over the course of the season as well. So I really don't buy into that theory. I don't think it was for a lack of leadership or anything like that. I think the execution from the hitters themselves just not there. And one of the interesting things that I think you heard from some of these guys towards the end of the year, and even as this was going on towards the beginning of the year, was they tightened up. And, I know people don't like to pretend that clutch hitting isn't a thing and that every situation is exactly the same, but that's really not the case. You heard it from multiple Mets hitters saying, for whatever reason, when we got in those situations with runners in scoring position, 2 outs, we needed to have a hit. We tried too hard. And as any Major League hitter will tell you, trying too hard is the bane of any hitter's existence. Hitters are at their best when they're laid back, when they're free and easy, when they're not thinking too much, when they're, the old cliche, not trying to do too much, but it's true. That's something that the Mets just failed at this year. I'm not sure there's another way to put it, because it was a good hitting team. They led the league in batting average. They had a ton of talent. It was the deepest lineup, I would say, they've had in probably 14 years. Since 2006. I'm not sure they've had a deeper or better lineup since then. They should have done more in terms of run production. Runners in scoring position was a problem. You saw it get better towards the end of the year. Had it been a 162-game season, maybe the story would have been different. But given that small sample size, it's kind of what the narrative of their season was.
All right, let's go to the NL Cy Young battle. It's likely that Jacob deGrom is not going to win his 3rd straight Cy Young, and Trevor Bauer of Cincinnati seems to be the frontrunner to win the award instead. Is that at the front of deGrom's mind, or is it more important for him to get the team in playoff contention year in and year out and act as a leader?
The individual stuff has always been secondary. It's kind of taken center stage for deGrom because the team hasn't made the playoffs, but believe me, he would trade the 2 Cy Youngs he has for a couple of World Series appearances, no doubt about it. Going into that final start, yeah, the Mets were mathematically still in contention, and by the way, if they just won their last 3 games, they would have made the playoffs. So that is truly, I believe, what was on Jacob deGrom's mind. And it's another thing. saying, look, it's a weird season. It's a weird Cy Young race because of it. It's not the who is the best pitcher in baseball award. It's the who had the best season award. And had it been a 162-game season, I don't have any doubts in my mind that Jacob deGrom probably would have won a third. He was pitching that well. And in 2018 and 2019, the reason why he won those awards was not because he was best from April through June. It was because he separated himself from the pack in late August and September as the guy who could maintain that performance over 6 months, which is really, really hard to do. So it's tough that this is the way that Jacob deGrom does not win 3 straight. Assuming he does not, I think Trevor Bauer will probably win it. Yu Darvish has a chance. deGrom will get plenty of votes, but it's hard to see him winning at this point. So it's a tough way for him to not get that three-peat, which I think would have kind of crystallized what he's been to the team, to the game over these past few seasons. Only 2 guys have done it, won 3 in a row, Greg Maddux and Randy Johnson. It would have been pretty heady company for Jacob deGrom to be in, but I don't think not winning it diminishes kind of his importance and how good he really is.
I'm joined by the Mets beat writer for MLB.com and chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America, Anthony DiComo. Mets fans are excited about new owner Steve Cohen. How do you think his taking over, assuming he gets approved by Major League Baseball, will shift the functionality of the team and what they do in the offseason?
Yeah, look, that's the $1 million question, or the $14 billion question, is how Steve Cohen will operate. And I think there are certainly a lot of assumptions because he is so individually rich, because he will immediately become the richest owner in Major League Baseball, that he will just start splashing around and bidding on every free agent and kind of doing a lot of things that the Mets didn't do under the Wilpons. And that very well might happen. That might be true, but I don't think you can just assume it. I don't think we know that for a fact yet. We'll find out a lot more in the coming weeks and months when the ownership transition does take place and we hear from Steve Cohen and talks about his plans for the team. But look, the old way wasn't working. The Mets made the playoffs 3 times in, I believe it was 16 years under the Wilpons. So we'll see how this is different. I think one of the big things he can do right away, more than just going into free agency and investing in JT Realmuto and Trevor Bauer and whoever else you want to put at the top of the class, is investing in the infrastructure of the organization, investing in scouting and development, investing in analytics, bolstering up a lot of those areas that maybe aren't easy to see by the naked eye from the average fan, but that are super important, and that teams that are successful in winning every single year, the Dodgers come to mind, the Yankees come to mind, teams that, yes, they spend a lot of money, but they also spend it smartly and they spend it in good areas. The Mets can become one of those teams that can create not just a team that's buying up free agents every year, but that's creating a player development machine. That's how you build a sustaining winner. It's been proven over decades, and I think that should be the number one priority for Steve Cohen coming in.
What does your job as a beat writer for the Mets entail, and how was it different this year, unlike any other before?
Well, it's different because there was no clubhouse access for us as reporters, and that's a big part of what we do is going in and building relationships with players, interviewing players, learning about these guys beyond what we see on the field, learning the why, the how of what we see on the field. And that was really difficult to do this year with everything on Zoom, everything in group interviews. There really wasn't much incentive for beat writers to travel because you're just doing your interviews on Zoom anyway. So it was weird. It took some getting used to. Hopefully we were able to work around some of that stuff and provide good, interesting coverage regardless. But I think any player will tell you, any reporter will tell you, probably any human being will tell you that hopefully this summer is the type of thing we never see again, because it's certainly not just baseball writing. And if the worst of my problems as a reporter are that I can't talk to Michael Conforto in person and I have to do it in Zoom, well then that's hardly all that bad of a thing compared to what's been going on in the country and the world. But a weird, you hear that word so much, but it's what it is. It was a weird season. It was weird from a coverage standpoint. But hey, we got through it, and hopefully 2021 will be better.
Now let's transition to David Wright, the topic of the new book, The Captain, available everywhere October 13th. What made his career so compelling to write about? I mean, how did you get the idea?
It's an idea that I had in the back of my head for years, just having covered him. And, I started covering the Mets as an intern in 2007, and David was one of the best players on that team, probably the best player on that team. And as the years went on and kind of the other guys left the clubhouse and David was the only one standing, you realize how big of a figure he was, how much he meant to the franchise. Not to mention on the field, he was producing at a Hall of Fame rate for a few years there. So it was always something that, as someone who my primary job is to cover the Mets, that I had kicking around in the back of my mind. And then when 2015 happens, when his spinal stenosis diagnosis happened, and he returned and had some of the most memorable moments of his career, working his way back from that, reaching the World Series, homering in the World Series, and then ultimately going down again and returning again in just that super emotional final game in 2018. The narrative arc was right there for anyone to see, and I thought it was kind of an obvious and interesting book topic. So I approached David toward the end of his final season and kind of gave him my idea, thinking I'd like to write a book about him, potentially with him, but either way, it would work. And he said, okay, I'm flattered, that's super interesting, let's talk about it after the season. So we talked about it after the season, and the more we did, the more he kind of indicated it would be interesting for him to write a memoir, make it a memoir for him in a first-person narrative, because he had a lot that he wanted to say, just in terms of, A, he thought it was, if his story can inspire anyone about the value of hard work and about the value of not letting external factors like a terrible back injury diagnosis let you down, that can only be a good thing. And the other part is he wanted something to show to his kids, almost like a time capsule of his career, so that they can look up when they're old enough and say, okay, well, Dad was pretty cool too, and see it from his eyes. This is what I was thinking. This is what I felt. You'll find in the book there's a lot of David's emotions in there, kind of laid it bare in a lot of spots about not just the things he was happy and proud about, but the things that disappointed him, the things that frustrated him, and so on and so forth. So it was an interesting, really cool project to work on. I'm super glad we did it. David is an absolute pro and made things easy working with him, and very excited for it to come out October 13th.
I'm joined by the New York Mets beat writer on MLB.com and chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America, Anthony DiComo. Wright talks a lot about former Met Cliff Floyd and how he introduced him to big league culture and influenced his leadership style. So what or who else influenced Wright's leadership style, and how does he treat young players upon their coming up?
Yeah, I think people assume that is something that came naturally to him because he was a pretty polished kid from day one when he came up. You could see him developing into a leader. But I don't think it's something that he was super comfortable with first, or ever became super comfortable with being that vocal leader that you would expect from someone who is the captain. But he did draw a lot. You mentioned Cliff Floyd. He talks a lot about coming up into a very veteran clubhouse with Cliff Floyd, with John Franco, with Joe McEwing, who was a big mentor of his. Willie Randolph became the coach his second season and had a big influence on him and kind of started grooming him to be a leader. So I think coming in and being deferential to those guys who all saw him the same way we all saw him as a future leader, and he just kind of took a little bit from every person, so that when it was his time, and when those guys left, and when all of a sudden David was the veteran in the room, he had been groomed by many people over many years to be that guy, and the transition came naturally at that point. So he was never the super vocal clubhouse presence, and I think that's what made his leadership style impactful, because he was the guy that when he talked, when he said something, it was important. And people listened, and that lasted throughout his career. And even today, a lot of the guys in the Mets clubhouse still played with him and hold a lot of respect for David Wright. And if he talks, they still listen. So there are different styles of leadership, and I think the way that David went about it was just kind of perfectly suited to his personality.
What would you consider Wright's biggest triumph and biggest regret to be throughout his career?
His favorite moment is an easy one. The World Series homer he considers kind of the pinnacle of his career.
What is New York going to get out of this guy, their captain, David Wright? He's had the bad back. He's got spinal stenosis. Played less than 40 games in the regular season. It's a cold night. High fly ball to left. Back at the wall, and the captain's going deep to the right.
It was not just the fact that he had been dreaming from childhood of playing in the World Series and like so many people, play around in his backyard and envision hitting a home run in the World Series. And to actually do it, I think would be a career highlight for anyone. But you put on top of that the fact that he was diagnosed that April, that May with spinal stenosis. He spent that entire summer rehabbing, just boring, mind-numbing stuff to make it back to the field. and was able to do it. People were wondering if his career was over at that point. He was able to come back. He hit a really memorable home run in Philadelphia in his first game back.
He hits one to deep left field. That is gone. David Wright brings himself back into the lineup with thunder.
Holy smokes! The captain is back. He hits one into the upper deck in left field. Unbelievable.
And then to go on and make the postseason for the first time in 9 years, to advance to the World Series, a stage of his career where you can appreciate a little bit more, being in his 30s at that time. You know, when he made the playoffs in 2006, it was kind of like you had this young core on the team. You had veteran leadership. The team was you assumed they would be there every year. So to go 9 years without making it, then making it back with all the backdrop that I just described, that was by far his career highlight. His biggest regret is it's tough because no one knows what would have happened. But on the field, there was a play in 2011, and I think a lot of Mets fans will remember this, when he dove to tag out Carlos Lee at third base against the Astros.
Chris Johnson to the right side. Justin Turner runs it down. His one-hop throw, though, goes past Reyes. Nobody's covering third base, so Lee's trying to get there, right racing him, and he tags him out. David Wright outruns Carlos Lee, who is hurt after making that dive into third base.
And wound up having a stress fracture in his back.
How about the hustle and dive that David took to apply the tag? Watch his head.
Wow.
He was out for a while. He came back. Never really thought twice about it until 2015. But in 2015, the doctors did tell him that the stress fracture probably led to a thickening of the bone in his back, which led to a lot of the problems he had later in his career. So if he could go back and do one thing again, I think it sounds simple, but not diving on that play, not jamming up his back and literally breaking his back on an effort play to try and tag Carlos Lee is something he probably would not have done again. But look, this is a guy who played every game. You know, it's a cliche, but did play every cliche as if it were his last. He never gave away at bats. He went about things the right way. He really kind of lived by the mantra that he didn't want to look back on his career and say, well, I could have done things differently, or I could have given a little more effort and been a better player, or lasted longer in the big leagues, or so on and so forth. He looks back on it now and can genuinely say that he maximized his talent, that he maximized his career. He wasn't the biggest, fastest, strongest, but for a time there, he was one of the best players in the league. He was on a Hall of Fame arc for a while, and for him to be able to do that and say, I couldn't have done all that much differently, I think allows him to sleep pretty easily at night now.
Talking about his new book, The Captain, it's the New York Mets beat writer on MLB.com and chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America, Anthony DiComo. What was so important to write about playing in his final game on September 29th? What did that day mean to him? Is that what he envisioned his long, tenacious fight back from the slew of injuries he fought off looking like?
No, it's not what he envisioned. He envisioned coming back, playing at an all-star caliber level again, making it back to the World Series, winning the World Series. That was his goal for all of this. It didn't happen. But for him to make it back to that final game, at some point when he was rehabbing there was a switch, and he realized that he wasn't going to be that all-star caliber player again. But he wanted to come back. He wanted to say goodbye to Mets fans. He wanted to, kind of as I described before, make sure that when he did retire, he couldn't look back and say, okay, I could have done more. If I had rehabbed a little bit harder, I could have come back and been that player again. So I think once he hit that point and he realized that he had done physically everything he could possibly do, it became a matter of saying goodbye to Mets fans, saying goodbye to all those who stood by him, having this event that his family could come to, that his daughters could come to, and just kind of getting some closure for his career. And that's something that a lot of guys don't get. A lot of guys don't get to author the end of their careers. Their bodies tell them what it is. They'll suffer an injury, or they'll get to the point where they can't perform anymore. And David did obviously suffer an injury, but for him to be able to come back and kind of put his own spin on that final game, I think did offer some closure, and certainly will rank up there, or does rank up there with, one of the most emotional, definitely the most emotional, one of the highlights of his career on the field. Anyone who was at Citi Field that day can kind of attest to how emotional it was. Him giving this impassioned speech with tears in his eyes on the field at the end of the game. Think about how many guys could do that. Think about how many guys have the support and the love of a fan base, not just in Queens, in New York, anywhere. to be able to do that, to, have the fan base kind of care that much about them, to have that send-off and to have it mean that much. He's one of the few, you could probably count him on one hand. So I do think it was important, both for him and both for Mets fans, for him to be able to play that final game. And it was a pretty spectacular game to be at for everyone who was there.
Because of the accolades he has and the leadership he exhibited as Mets captain, Wright will probably have his number 5 retired by the team and will be inducted into the Mets Hall of Fame. So what about Cooperstown? Could Wright be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame despite the injuries that shortened his career?
Yeah, probably not. You look at the careers of similar guys who were cut short. Don Mattingly is the obvious comp that comes to mind just because he had similar back problems, was also on a All-Star Hall of Fame arc for a while, but just didn't compile enough. I think if you look at the numbers, he's probably not going to get in, and David's aware of that. I think if you had asked him, what's he regret not getting in the Hall of Fame or not getting in the World Series, he would 1,000 out of 1,000 times say not winning the World Series. So just to have accomplished what he did accomplish in New York, as you mentioned, number 5 is going to be up there someday. I think that goes without saying. He'll be in the Mets Hall of Fame. He retired as the greatest Mets position player there ever was. He will live out the rest of his life as probably one of the 5 best Mets who ever lived. That's a lot for any guy. And yes, Hall of Fame would have been nice, especially when you look at what he accomplished 2005, 2006, 2007, going forward. So he had some other Hall of Fame years in there. It could have happened. Not many guys put up those kinds of numbers, but the longevity wasn't there. It's a regret that he has for sure that he wasn't able to do it for longer. But as I mentioned earlier, he did do everything he could. He kind of maximized physically what he was able to do on the field. So I don't think there's going to be any great regret if he doesn't get in the Hall of Fame that he won't.
Wright's relationship with Tom Seaver was something that he talked about after Seaver passed away recently from complications due to dementia and COVID-19. Wright himself says that Seaver and him didn't talk much about baseball, but more about life. What did Seaver mean to Wright as a mentor and a person, and how can you describe their relationship?
Well, you have to understand that David Wright grew up a Mets fan. He wanted to be a Met. Once he became a Met, he wanted to be a Met for life. So all of this that we've talked about, how important he was to the franchise and how important the franchise was to him, it was a big part of his life. And anyone who is involved with the Mets knows Tom Seaver, easily the greatest pitcher, easily the greatest player in franchise history. I don't think anyone would argue either of those 2 points. So, of course, Tom Seaver was important to David Wright. And when David broke in the early 2000s, Seaver was still around. He hadn't yet kind of retired off to the vineyards in Northern California. He was around. He was a presence. And as someone who grew up a Mets fan, how could David not kind of soak in as much as he could from Tom Seaver? But I think the other part of that was David and I didn't have a relationship with Tom Seaver. I personally never met him, but I kind of, from hearing stories, I know he's this way too. One of the things David always wanted was not to be treated any differently than anyone else just because he was really good at baseball. His relationships were best with guys who just treated him like another guy, who didn't put him on a pedestal. And I think Tom Seaver was the same way. So when 2 guys like that meet, all of a sudden they can talk to each other about things that aren't baseball, and they're not just always talking about how, hey, remember that time when you pitched that great game? Hey, remember that time when you had a great game? Like, no, they want to just have normal interactions with normal people. You look at some of David's best friends in life, it's not a who's who of all-stars. It's, one of his best friends is the Mets' longtime bullpen catcher. He's still great friends with a lot of his high school, childhood friends, things like that. A lot of the best friends he made in clubhouses were kind of the lesser players on roster that weren't the best players on the team. So I think a lot of that went into the relationship they had with Seaver because Seaver was the same way. And, yeah, I'm sure there was also a nod to each other, in terms of their places in Mets history. They are probably, at least in my opinion, the greatest pitcher and the greatest position player that the team has ever had.
Writing the book with David after he went through so many ups and downs throughout his career must have been a cathartic experience for him, and probably will be for Mets fans as well. What can fans look forward to when the book comes out on October 13th?
Well, I think that's a great word, cathartic. And he's mentioned this a bunch of times, is that when he was playing his career, there was no stopping to reflect. There was no, okay, I've accomplished X, Y, Z, and my goals are this. It was more grinding. It was every day you go to sleep, you wake up the next day onto the next starting pitcher that you're facing, onto the next week, onto the next month, onto the next season. And I think doing this project kind of gave him an opportunity and an excuse to go through and go back and remember all the little granular details of his career, but also look at it from the big picture of, what things meant to him, what it all entailed. And so I think that's, one of the cool things in the book is seeing things through his perspective. I was there for a lot of it as a reporter. I covered him from 2007 until his retirement in 2018, and I saw things from my perspective, but kind of going through it and seeing things from his eyes are really, really cool, whether that's coming up as a young, hyped prospect, whether that's making the playoffs in 2006 and falling short in that Cardinals series, whether that's the collapses of 2007, 2008, how much that hurt him, how much that hurt the Mets, their fan base. And then obviously all that we talked about after that in terms of signing a contract extension, getting it hurt, making it back, making the World Series in 2015, hitting a home run in the World Series, grinding back from more rehab after that, finally his final game in 2018. Seeing that from his perspective, through his eyes, I think is a really cool thing. I think Mets fans will really appreciate understanding maybe a little more of what he went through physically, and also just how much this meant to him on an emotional level. It's really cool. I like the way it turned out. I think, if you're a Mets fan, if you're a David Wright fan, or even if you're just a baseball fan, it's something that's a cool kind of glimpse into a high-level professional athlete's eyes and just everything they go through to make this happen. So, like I said, I'm super excited for it to come out October 13th. I know a lot of people have pre-ordered already. If you haven't, I'd recommend you do so, because it's something that I think is a really cool thing to have on any sports fan's bookshelf.
Thank you, Anthony, for your time, insight, and dedication in chronicling one of the best Mets and third basemen in baseball history.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You can pre-order Anthony DiComo's new book, The Captain, from wherever you get your books. It's set to be released on October 13th. For WRHU's The Batter's Box, I'm Derek Futterman. Sound courtesy of SMY, WOR, WCBS, Fox Sports, and MLB.com.